It really isn't often that one gets to introduce a speaker who's genuinely revolutionized poetry, late 20th century, early 21st century poetry, thinking about poetry, poetics. So it's a real honour for me to introduce Charles Bernstein, who is multi-award winning poet, critic, editor, collaborator, thinker, and he's been at the forefront of radical poetics since editing the magazine Language with Bruce Andrews in the late 70s and early 80s, and of course became, or is still, one of the leading language poets himself. He went on to become the director of the Poetics program at Buffalo and set up the extraordinary Electronic Poetry Center with Los Pequeño Glaser in, I think, 1995, which is a resource that I still use regularly with students and for myself, and was an extraordinary archive of the most exciting things happening in poetry. And I suppose I want to use that as one example of a kind of generosity, I think, that goes with Charles's involvement with poetry and poetics. The fact that he was part of putting together an archive that showed the best of what was possible and made it open to those of us in the backwaters of the UK that found it utterly, utterly radical, and still do. This, of course, has now been extended to the Penn Sound Archive at the University of Pennsylvania, where Charles is now the Donald T. Reagan Professor of English and Comparative Literature. It's quite likely that many of us here today became interested in poetry, in poetics, in radical poetics, because of Charles Bernstein's work and his thinking around poetics. Amit spoke earlier about the sort of fantasy of inaugural moments in a writer's life, and one of mine, if I can call myself a writer in this context, actually was encountering Charles's poem essay, Artifice of Absorption. This was in the office of someone we discovered as a kind of mutual acquaintance. And I was a beginner poet then, and from where I was sitting, which really was the soggy, Larkin-esque suburbs of British poetry, it really was as though a window had been opened on the possibilities of poetic language. But equally, the ways of thinking about poetry, poetics, as a way of thinking politically. And this was a decisive factor in my dedication, I suppose, thenceforth to poetry. Charles's work always provokes, it unsettles. This is true of both his poetry and his critical work. He described himself yesterday at dinner as curmudgeonly. I'm not going to argue with that, but I would like to add to that that if that is so, then it is always in a benign way. His work isn't of the sort that tries to belittle or shut up the opposition. On the contrary, there's a kind of generosity and an opening up of conversation. And that's something that I've already found to be the case just in the last couple of days here. So this is true of all of his work, including perhaps most recently Attack of the Difficult Poems, Essays and Inventions, and The Pitch of Poetry from 2016, of which critic Pierre Joris wrote, "This is criticism that makes up its own rules, then doesn't follow those either." So it's in this spirit that I'd like to welcome Charles, whose title today is Before Time for David Antin.
So I'm going to relentlessly focus on the topic, and I am going to be grumpy just in the way that you're saying, and I think you'll find some of my remarks will seem grumpy, but really, or polemical, but really just to sort of raise those issues. And artifice of absorption, really in a way that's a key to what I'm interested in, especially in dialogue with what you were saying before, because artifice of absorption, you could say that the kind of absorption that I'm critical of there is in story, and by the anti-absorptive, breaking it out, is the only way you can get some more multi-level writing, thinking, art going. So the absorption still remains a topic, but what I'm seeking there is hyper-absorption, a higher level of absorption. So then that's true about the story here, and so far as I'm against it, it's because I want something beyond it. This talk was written in the last 2 days on these pieces of paper from the pad that was given to us very nicely, and the pen that was also given to us, using the materials at hand, and just showing you that I'm sorting it through, so it's the order is not determined beforehand, and I'll read it in the order that it turns out here. So, and I'm going to read two poems in the course of that, which will be marked by the cards, and also I'll start and end with a poem as well. And the one I'm going to start with is called Before Time, and it very much takes up the theme from the beginning of time, because from the beginning of time, the only real solution for that is to think maybe time is the problem and try to get before time, even if from the beginning of time started in 1975 in your chronology. The last thing I'm going to read is the Stele for Failed Time. I'll just read a small section of the final part of Stele for Failed Time from Shadow Time. It's a libretto I wrote for Brian Ferneyhough, and it's about the work of Walter Benjamin. And Brian and I wanted to do something that was a plotless opera, so it's an opera of thought or ideas. And so I'm just thinking of the earlier talk about cutting out the prologue to the film that started just a couple of hours ago, because I remember the director of the festival at the time when it was starting at the Munich Biennale said, you have to convince Brian to cut the second act. This was in rehearsals, because the second act was a guitar solo, and the guitarist is sitting on stage, and she said, this is just unacceptable. It's an opera. It's not only you're not having a plot, but there's nothing happening. And I explained, as I do in the libretto, that it was supposed to be the sounds of the wings of the angel of history. This didn't really totally convince her, and there was a lot of problems people had, I guess, with our opera, and also people liked it too. But I think that this final section deals with Benjamin's concept of Zeitzeit, now time, and I think in a lot of ways that's, in a sense, what I'm talking about, how plot and story can really steal this now time, and that one, as an artist, dialectically and through rhythm, is trying to break through to allow that sound of something that breaks. So, this is Before Time, and it's after S.Y. Agnon, after Gershom Scholem, after the Baal Shem Tov. In a time before beginnings, the songs of poets echoed the language of cosmos, and cosmos echoed poets' charms. Poem and cosmos were as intertwined as thunder and lightning. After aeons, the poets' songs fell on deaf ears. Still, poets sang of that archaic time when their words called the sentient world into being. And these new charms were as marvelous as the awe-inspiring songs of the archaic times they celebrated. After a succession of generations, poets sang no more. Yet their poems invoked with fervor and majesty the memory of ancient songs. Many eras passed, poets no longer remembered the ancient songs or their secrets. Still, they recognized the loss and created phantasmagorias that collapsed unto themselves, plenitudes of metamorphosis amidst dazzling emptiness. These new poems were possessed of such stunningly dark mysteries that the universes, visible and invisible, shuddered when they were performed. And now, inestimable time after the mythic creators of these dark phantoms, poets have no memory even of the loss of the ancient songs. Their words ring hollow against an indifferent universe. They are bereft of images, of stories, of illusion. In these times, poems are made just of words in infinite constellations. Yet in their supernal impotence, these poems are as sublimely demonic, world-defining, world-defying as those most archaic songs of the time before beginnings. So I guess I'm advocating for disruption, interruption, and discontinuity, and for the not obviously relevant as crucial facts to what verbal art can be. Every element is supposed to be doing the job, Govinda Singh's films. I'm just trying to get your name, so that's what I wrote down here. In your discussion of the scenography, you're saying everything has to fit in, and what this imperative, whether it be in film, in opera, in novels, and also in poetry, prevents this possibility of the break of continuity, which to me is crucial, and the foregrounding of the material dimension of verbal language in writing and in poetry, and the conflict between image and sound in film. I was thinking also of Godard, other experimental filmmakers in the American experimental films, where there isn't sync between the sound and the image. Is a crucial part of what that can be in film. I dedicate this work to David Antin, the way Jeffrey did to John Ashbery, contemporary of Ashbery's. Antin died a couple of years ago. His work is tremendously important to me as a reimagination of poetry and the essays. What he did is to refuse to read anything he'd already written, but to do talks that became art pieces that he called poems. So it changed the nature of what the essay was, as well as what poems were. And then he would transcribe that from the tape recordings into talk pieces that you could read. Although the performance was crucial, and he would say that when you do something live with people looking at you and responding, that changes what it is, that the site specificity of the performance is crucial. And also he was very critical of something that I'm less critical of, which is disjunction and collage. And he felt that if you talk through the whole piece, even though it had different elements, it would bring together the work in a way that radical disjunction and collage doesn't do. So what I'm doing here is in a way a perverse tribute to him, because I'm insisting on the disjunction of the different cards. Non-plot elements of verbal art would include rhythm, tempo, gesture, sound, performance, accent, timbre, allusion, echo, pitch, rhyme, seriality, rhetoricity, touch, tactility, taste, collage, erasure, voicelessness, the audible trace of the recording device or amplification system, typography, rhymelessness, pattern, tone, tune, patternlessness, tunelessness, non-sensuous similarity from Benjamin, Doctrine of Similarity, hasty, puns, color, thickness, style, form, syntax, decoration, utterance, incomprehensibility, artifice, visualization, the page in visual poetry as design, context of publication, paper, digression, vocables, in liberty, the word as echo, not ideas but actual word stuff, to quote William Carlos Williams, the unconscious, fetish, the particular, not reified or subsumed into a story, voice, or theory. The jargon of authenticity as the truth of stories, as a theme only, becomes an absolutely compelling desire for poetry as much as for fiction. So lots of the discussion here has been how this has been an effect on fiction or stories, but within the United States, it becomes the sine qua non of what's legitimate in poetry, and the hatred of poetry, in a sense, that doesn't foreground its authenticity, its personal voice, its witnessing. So what you have is a strange sort of, going on your theory, you have this exoticizing of Eastern culture and insisting that they're telling untold stories, which is a projected primitivism of the West, famous from modernist period, but then the reimportation of that by seemingly progressive poets who feel that that's got to be the model for authenticity and that anything else is a kind of attack on authenticity. In Language Magazine, we really tried to provide a forum for those who are working with an alternative to the single unified voice or tone that emphasized kind of Brechtian alienation effect, Befremdungseffekt, Ostrananie, the making strange in Russian formalism, against compulsory storytelling. And it's really compulsory storytelling as opposed to narrative that is the issue, because it becomes a cudgel to repress any kind of difference in the name of celebrating difference and otherness, so that artifice and invention is often taken as the subject of scorn and continues to be the subject of scorn. A novel like Paul Auster's most recent 4321 uses multiple stories that conflict to create something that's comparable to what I'm talking about, because each version of the story changes. This constant shifting of pattern makes you aware of versions and change and the lack of fixity and authenticity. Versions not fixed also is reflected in a work like Samuel Delaney's Motion of Light in the Water, his great memoir, in which each example in the style of the Tractatus Logico Philosophicus of Wittgenstein has multiple versions, and which conflict, so that you're constantly aware of the conflict. And this conflicting of frames seems crucial to me to bring out what you could say is this Yeitzeit, something that's beyond the subsumption in a single frame that is the problem with the kind of storytelling that we're talking about here. This is a quote from an Amit essay of Tagore. I know almost nothing about Tagore compared to those of you here or at all, but this quote that you used struck me as being a crucial point. So this is the Tagore in the translation. This is chiefly because one's mind, like a fisherman, casts a net of integration and accepts only what it can gather together at a single haul. Everything else eludes it. When it sees, it does not properly hear. When it hears, it does not properly see. And when it thinks, it neither sees nor hears properly. It has the power to move all irrelevancies far away from the path of its set purpose. So this, well, I don't actually know the context of it, seems exactly to me the main point. It gets the problem that in the desire for authenticity in stories actually always excludes, reduces, and is a kind of falsification. I told my wife, I don't want any more stories. Tell me what you think. I told my husband, I don't want any more stories. Tell me what you mean. I told my mother, I don't want any more stories. Just tell me what you want. I told my father, I don't want any more of your stories. I just want to know what I did wrong. I told my rabbi, I don't want any more of your stories. I just want to know how to get out of here. I told my friend, I don't want any more of your stories. I just want to know what's going on. I told my professor, I don't want any more of your stories. I just want to know that you're going to stop. I told my president, I don't want any more of your stories. Just get your foot off my face. Blake has always, for many of us, seemed a paradigm of somebody who was against commensurability and the idea that every plot, every part should fit, the sound and the image, the different parts of the plot. And in the Four Zoas, his great prophetic work, he actually produced it in a way that every version is different and that this parts between the plates or the pages don't connect one to another. So you never get continuity, and every version is somewhat different in terms of what that continuity is. So you're faced with the incommensurability. Also was thinking of the sick rose, which came up earlier. O rose, thou art sick, the invisible worm that flies in the night, in the howling storm has found out thy bed of crimson joy, and his dark secret love does your life destroy. That the worm, the invisible worm, is stories. It's the way that stories reify, consume, and destroy this contact with what Amit was calling acknowledgement, as in the shot in Vertigo that you talked about, this thing that doesn't fit in, the thing that stands out. That's what the rose is. That's what the worm is destroying, and could be related again to Zeit, to now time in Benjamin. This is after Henry David Thoreau and Irving Goffman. There are nowadays many proponents of storytelling, but it is admirable to tell stories because it was once admirable to live. In Goffman's great book, Framelock, which is a very important work for me, he basically describes human interactions as mostly recounting things that happen. There's very little original things that go on. It's mostly people talking about what happened after the fact or what somebody said. This constant reframing seems to be consuming life. So it's where would be this activity that wasn't a recounting is hard to know, but it's possible for verbal art and other art to actually create some sensation of the now time. David Antin compares and contrasts narrative with plot in one of his essays, and I think this distinction is very significant. It sort of changed my view about how poetry could be narrative, or how even what I'm doing now could be understood as narrative, but not story. So for Antin, plot is just a series of events that occur one after the other, as in, for example, a typical opera libretto, which are insane, just set of events that happen. But narrative is the transformation of that so that something else occurs. And so one really is trying to push away from plot and story for this richer conception of what narrative might be. Also think of Laura Riding Jackson's book, The Telling, where she essentially renounces poetry for being too concerned for artifice and feels that it's the telling, not of the telling actually in her case of the story of us all, kind of a philosophical telling of direct speech, one person to another without artifice, which is what she's trying for. It's an impossible thing, but she also deals with that in Progress of Stories. The possibility of having conflicting frames rather than a single frame in which everything is subsumed can be understood in terms of frame analysis, because you, by foregrounding the effect of the toggling of frames, you also allow for rhythm, but you also allow for the understanding of how the frames are actually producing the meaning in different ways. Now I have my first poem I'm going to read. This is Johnny K. Kahlo. So quolen swackt und miri flupt, sardoon to flagrant swerm, ort germy plate, or garvy swait, ib gibbon durs, klurpf, sheb booties blur, de daisies duo, dun froopy giggles gly, Judd Krylofane, Jed Jimsies Cack, Ernst Erdobel, Fump Glyer, Eb Hure Blut, Ig Ore Sweep, Neb Nist, Neb Op, Neb Guan, Schleb Atsum Imba, Outsi Burft, Alapi Murph, Av Ords, Ein Ainsley Swish, Ein Ainsley Sploop, Ugals, Deb Dolster Flug, Ig Ars Unimbit, Trul Begrub, ig uberquate ag blurg. I'm thinking here also of Shklovsky's idea of plotless prose. And so this is after that and after pound. Never use any word that contributes to a plot. Each sentence must resist the sentence before it. Even the absence of narrative had to be narrated. Today we have an Oxford Union debate resolved that stories should be abolished. For the proposition, Donald Duck. Against, Donald Trump. The reference to Trump is anything but idle, because I think Trump really is the example of our time, at least in the U.S., but globally, of the really the danger, the sinister aspect of what storytelling can be. Now, I understand that using story in this way is highly partial, and that many people mean different things by it when I'm calling narrative. But I want to go with this idea of being against it, because I think it's too easy not to see the invisible worm of the story. And in Trump's case, you see a perfect example. His story on Twitter is more important than so-called than anything else, than the facts or any other detail. He's able to tell those stories, and the people who support him believe it, and all the rest of the media is left to respond to his story, saying his story isn't true, or they're alternate stories. And once that happens, you get sucked in to a lose-lose situation. He's always going to be on top, because the story is always going to win unless you question the story. Then on the other hand, the New York Times and the mainstream media say sometimes it's really the post-structuralists and the postmodernists, in a way people like me, who question a univalent truth that have allowed for this fake news, this idea of post-truth to come in. Whereas, in fact, it's exactly the opposite. It's the claim that you can have these stories which have truth that are the problem, and when you question the storyline of truth-telling, you're actually questioning the ability of people like Trump to get away with what they're doing. So the very response to the storytelling of Trump, it contributes to his power to control the way people respond and what they focus on. And of course, obviously it's a distraction and everything else, but people always wonder, well, how can he just keep saying the same things that are not true? Well, he can say it because it's viewed as a story. Stories don't have to be true. He's telling his overall view, and everything fits into that. So this is what I've called in earlier essays frame lock, and I want to switch this also to the issue of academic discourse. Academic discourse we don't think of as stories, but in some way, when an academic paper is submitted to an academic publication, it's supposed to have a thesis, it's supposed to have a beginning, middle, and end, it's supposed to demonstrate what that thesis is, it works with an expository logic, and that's the equivalent of a story, and it's in a single frame. What I'm interested in essays is proliferating frames that compete, and not just two, it's got to be 3 or more frames. And this could also be related to Emerson, who's really our great American thinker in this way, of moods, that in a given essay or a given piece of thought, moods change. Your actual opinion may change radically within the course of the essay, and you may say things that are contradictory. And this is what I call aversive thinking. So this would change the nature of what's understood by fragmentation, and it goes back to the issue of disjunction. What's the relationship of, I mean, we're interested in particulars that aren't subsumed by a larger story, aren't reified. At the same time, it's been a mistake to think that fragments are broken off from the other things that surround them, or that fragmentation is the invention of artists or poets, as opposed to the conditions of everyday life for most people who live fragmented lives in cities in multiple different contexts that they have to behave in different ways. And I really go for the Walter Benjaminian concept of constellation. Never think of fragment as something isolated. It's always in a constellation, and then one could read those constellations in different ways. The way one looks at the Big Dipper is what he's thinking of. But the Big Dipper isn't an actual thing. It's not has to be looked at as a Big Dipper, but you can see it that way. And it's creating work that can be read in different constellations, which means having multiple frames, that creates the art object and also resists this false picture of avant-garde destruction of meaning. Because really what goes on is not the destruction of meaning, not meaninglessness, but the active creation of meaning and not the assumption of meaning. Jerome McGann has an essay called Contemporary Poetry, Alternate Roots from 1988, in which he compares non-narrative to anti-narrative. By non-narrative, he's thinking of someone like Ron Silliman, who creates patterns of his sentences together based on things like the Fibonacci series. So there are different constellations of repetition that you can read, and you're aware of what the patterns are, rather than it just be a kind of aestheticized line break. In the prose poems, it creates alternate or aleatoric systems. And in general, you could think of Cage and McClough in this way as well, those who use constraints or programs, and you could see what they are to generate it. The other side, which he associates with my work, is anti-narrative. And Blake would again be the kind of paradigmatic figure, especially the Four Zaws, where you're constantly trying to push against narrative, to conflict with narrative. It creates a different kind of a hyper-narrative, or against absorption. So now my second poem. This one's called Rivulets of the Dead Jew. Fill my plate with boudin noir, boudin noir, boudin noir. Fill my plate with a hi, hey, ho, and a rumble I will go. Don't dance with me till I cut my tie, cut my tie, cut my tie. Don't dance with me till the rivers run dry. And a hey, and a hi, and a ho. I've got a date with a bumblebee, bumblebee, bumblebee. I've got a date with a wee, bonny, wee, and a hurtling, we will go. American radio, as listened to by the upper middle class, educated people, national public radio, is obsessed and consumed by the stories in the worst possible way. And TED Talks is the most famous example, but NPR has endless numbers of programs in which they interview people. So an example in terms of Trump is, rather than actually talk about the global economic system or tax policy, health policy, you interview a Trump supporter just to know what do they feel. They tell an anecdote that their wife had cancer, they struggled, the wife died, and then that's it. It's just this set of set of plots, no possibility of narrative. Everybody has a story, of course, and it goes along with this kind of underlying and repulsive conception of humanism, as if to show that something is human is a good thing. I mean, I think it's very hard to argue that the human is a good thing. By and large, if you say this is human, this really shows humanity, that should scare us. I'm scared by it. And I think really, I don't need to make an exaggerated claim, I think this is how Trump won, because the response on the part of the non-Trump media was through these kind of stories and trying to listen, as opposed to understanding that the discourse of storytelling itself was a problem. Now, you talked about you're getting your criticism of your prologue, but I was asked, surprisingly, by one of the most popular of these radio shows to write a poem to be broadcast on January 20th of last year, the day of the inauguration. So it was an inaugural poem, which I wrote. It was called Our United Fates, and I was paid actually quite well for it. But they didn't run it. It might be that they didn't run it because I had a line in there that the American dream is just piss on the outhouse floor. But I don't think that was the reason. I think they could have lived with that. I think it was because there was no story. It was a poem that questioned the idea of stories and questioned the whole narrative of America. And so they wouldn't run it, whereas they have endless people telling absolutely just unbearably tedious. Now, I like tedium and boredom and ennui, but this kind of makes all those things seem bad. So my final card comes up very well, and then I'll read the section of Stele for Failed Time. This card intentionally left blank. So this is a solo for Melancholia as the angel of history. And some of you will know this image of Melancholia as a Dura print, sad-looking angel. And the angel of history you actually referred to in your talk, the angel going backward from the clay painting. So Brian had this in mind to have this epilogue be sung by a chorus, actually, but as the angel of history. Just as I, no sooner than I had seen you for the first time, journeyed back with you from where I came, and the faces I saw had disappeared, unable to trace what I had known too long, just as you journeyed back with me, no sooner than we met, where you fell for the first time, hardly to face the facts I saw, what I had known always disappearing, and the places you saw unable to trace what's known, then gone, just as I journeyed back with you, no sooner than I held you from where I came for the last time, never to face the facts I saw, what I had forgotten, now whispers, just as you, no sooner than you touched me, for the first time journeyed back with me to where I am. Tvodle huxes quant at me vuxe huxes quant at me ke vu desivute mute vut seriously. Blame is a child's game played by men in the furor of their discontent. Tef mux naf joie nuves vun vous vumamati vous june vous zi tifo fata fatalit. Beyond the despair is the listlessness of not, the shipwreck of the irrational on the shores of the promise. This is where I found her, disappearing into tears, hidden in the marks of the victor's tears. Vu ini tomamatu dev qua havu zum jetsatu vuk nevishti vis ho a aksamati. Blame, a child's game played by men in the bureaus of their contempt. Vux av a ke ak av quishuk tin tif sao atum oli kumuf hak zamat fatsu. Deep in the heavens, high on the breeze, I told the examiner, found the key, went to the opening, key didn't fit, forged another, it got ripped. First there's a tumble, then there's a sash, so irksome you scratch it, scratch till it's ash, losing the battles, winning the war, sinking in quicksand when you can think at all. Sometimes look back, sometimes set fire, who's to judge? No one's above desire. The monkey you are, the angels you'll be, when truth comes to lashes, when language is weed. Zami vun tvexi him vu vevetamana sik vut at me vugmak. I back away helpless, my eyes fixed. This is my task, to imagine no holes from all that has been smashed. For now time is lost. Now time is cracked. Now time is empty. Now time is framed. Now time is lived. Now time is hollow. Now time is smoke. Now time is stolen. And the new angels pass away like sparks on coals, just as we, no sooner than we had seen each other for the first time, journeyed back together from where we came. The best picture of a picture is not a picture, but the negative. The negative pictures the picture, just as I picture you, without ever seeing the picture you see as your reflection. What can't be seen is still apprehended, even as I lose more than I retain, as I go backward in time toward time's end. Keeping still, I misplace the picture of the picture, tossed in tales of the tune of the telling, unraveling the threads that hold the leaves, shattering the frieze. The best picture of a picture is not the picture, but its reverse, reversing tales until they unfold. In the tolling, even as I regret more than I resemble, in the tumble of my apprehensive incomprehending. The negative pictures the picture better than the picture, just as I picture you, without ever having seen you or touched you, as now you fall from my arms into my capacious, insomniac forgetting. For now time is lost, now time is gain, now time is now time is full, now time is lived, now time is hollow, now time is made, now time is stone.
Wow, that was fantastic. Thank you. Do we have a bit of time? We do. Yeah, good. I'm sure there'll be lots of questions and responses. And I suppose I wanted to start by thinking about the ways in which you demonstrated refusing absorption, conflicting frames, and so forth as a kind of a method and a procedure. And yet you began with the premise in relation to David Antin of a kind of radical synthesis. And I just wondered if I could ask you a bit more about what that might be. Is there a kind of method for that? Well, sorry, did anyone hear that?
You know, the problem is time, time immemorial. So you get out, which is history in Benjamin, certainly. So you can't really get outside of history. You're always going to have envisionments and stories and narratives, and as you're always in history. At the same time, there's the potential for a dialectical process in which you can push toward some utopian but impossible now-time moment outside of that. So that's as with a lot of utopian thought within poetry, which I would distinguish from utopian thought within everyday politics, also allows for certain well, in a way, it's what you were saying about the details that don't fit in, the specific things that kind of push back the physical materiality. And I think the physical materiality in poetry, I mean, we all have our own ways of doing it. There's not a single thing. Obviously, I'm interested, you know, just in making noise with the microphone in the poem that I made of all made-up words, and the way that there's the made-up language in the stele for Veiled Time, which is actually created by moving the vowels and consonants one stop over from some of the things in it, so that you create this kind of echo. The echo is a kind of a space for thinking. But so synthesis and totalization, and this I'm actually, you know, I share this thought with many other people who've written about it in more detail. I'm not really a political philosopher or philosopher per se, but I'm, you know, interested in it and engaged with it. But I think it's negative dialectics, of course, that I'm invoking, Adorno's idea, in the stele, and I remain interested in negative dialectics as an aesthetic experience, but I also think it's deeply tied up with pleasure. And one of the things that I find interesting is this pushback against the kind of pleasure of poetry, the pleasure of sound, the pleasure of pulling things apart and recombining them, as if somehow it's an attack on meaning, it's an attack on pleasure, it's an elitist thing that only privileged people can do. And this issue of privilege, I mean, this is what I was getting at when I'm saying we're re-importing. That's a very sinister. Of course, people are privileged, but it's often the people who are saying that something is privileged that are privileged. So it's like they're saying we're identifying with this other thing which is not privileged, but they themselves are not in a different situation from that point of view. So you can't evaluate what the structural pleasures and innovations of a work is if you have this idea that anything that departs from a kind of norm, which isn't privilege, but deprivileging, it deprivileges everybody, pulls everybody down. That's the only measure of value. It's a very strong anti-aesthetic moment that we have in the U.S. in respect to that, and it creates this nostalgia for an authenticity. Or even a synthesis that is not in the cards, you might say. But there is something in the cards, and it's shuffling them and seeing the pleasure of that shuffle, and also not mystifying it. One of the things I liked about Ron Silliman's early work that McGann talks about, the non-narrative, he said, you can have disjunction, but it doesn't have to be mystical, like, oh, I just like. You can actually show what the process is. You do this permutation. You can do it yourself. You can see what the process is. So unbearing that process is itself a kind of a pleasure of reason, even if it's outside of techno-rationality. So.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, the emphasis on pleasure there, I think, is really interesting, and connects well with yesterday Jeffrey's piece about the pleasure of reading, and it's something that actually has been quite a consistent theme of the last couple of days. I'm conscious that there must be lots of people. Yeah.
Read that wonderful poem in memory of John Ashbery, and today you read this poem for David Antin, both of whom recently died.
That's right.
So my question is about literary friendship and death. What does it mean, I guess, since both of you are working in a sort of strange space where you're friends, but also sharing a tradition of poetry with these figures. What is the meaning of death? Is death a passage into immortality or mortality? I mean, of course, the Hindu will tell you that that's not the end of things, but I mean, what does it mean? Is it something wonderful? Is it scary? Does it inspire fear, affection, love? How do you feel when a close poet has died with whom you identify?
I like just the simple question, what is the meaning of death? But I think I'll postpone answering that for the moment. As far as that generation older than me, I think Jeff and I share a real engagement, love, and appreciation for the poets that come before us and before that. I mean, that's why I don't have a PhD, but I started to teach when I was 40 and really got involved in teaching a full range of poetry internationally as well as U.S. And then I became friends with a whole set of people like John Ashbery, who I loved, and David Antin. So for me, and I don't necessarily feel. I think that's just very. I see that that's not that common in a way. I mean, in a way, my world was so much built on this generation older than me, which were fundamental. So I feel that loss, and also the continuity of what I do. So Picture Poetry has a whole set of tributes just to arrange poem. It goes back to a long piece on Gertrude Stein, but continues to Leslie Scalapino, who's a younger poet of my generation who died. So. I think that there's a lot to be said, and that I do say about channeling is another way to talk about what I'm saying, and it's often said in a way I don't like. It seems sort of either a kind of a mystification or kind of phony spiritualism. Whereas for me, so rather than say listening to the voices of the dead, which I do think is what happens, but I like the term echopoetics, ECHO. Echopoetics, so that rather than illusion, I'm hearing these things that constitute my life as a writer, echoing back and forth, and that my work echoes that back. And I think in the work that Fernie Howe and I did with Shadow Time, there's a lot. But Stille for Failed Time, that's about the dead. That's about the Shoah, the Kurban, I'd say his murder. People say he committed suicide, but I think it's not the right way to look at it. It's not really suicide. He was driven, and he represents a certain kind of European Jewish culture that for a long time I didn't really understand. That continuation of European Jewish culture is in me because it was wiped out to a large extent. There are Jews, of course, still in Europe. To a large extent, that secular kind of Benjaminian thing is destroyed, and where does it go? So that poem and that opera is really an attempt to answer that question.
We got time for one more question? Who's the time? one more, then we'll finish. Thank you.
I was wondering if you make a distinction. Just wondering if you make a distinction between discontinuity and silence, because as a reader of Artifice of Absorption, I have kind of grappled with that question for very long. That how do you think the blank card against the invented language?
Yeah, well, I mean, silence is it's a very powerful term, especially when you think of people being silenced. I think of Adrienne Rich's great work on the women being silenced. I think that's different than other, and there's John Cage's silence too. But I mean, silence is like figure and ground, which I like to say. You can't have rhythm without having silence. As a performer and as a person, I'm not big on silence, so I don't leave a lot of blank space. But even the micro amounts that exist, exist for a purpose. But the term I'd use more related to that is what this piece ended on, which is blank. And there blank is once again something that's resonant to speak of here too, because it's blank for us in America in a way comes from the East as an idea, as a non-teleological idea of being in the present and allowing the present to speak. But for me, allowing the present to speak is very noisy. It's not silent. There's a great Jewish joke that I'll end with, and I think we probably have to end the session, which is Rabbi Stephen Wise was spoken to by the cardinal and said that I went to the I went to the Christian heaven, Catholic heaven, and it was so peaceful and quiet and so beautiful. And then I went to the Jewish heaven, and it was noisy, it was smelly, people were arguing, they were screaming. And Stephen Wise said, yes, I had that same experience. I went to that Christian heaven. There was nobody there.
That's a fantastic place to end this session.